You know, one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein is when he said, "The only reason for time is so that everything doesn't happen all at once." In the beginning of the modern scientific era, materialists thought that the universe was infinite, never had a beginning. It was just always there. But if time had no limit, no beginning, then mind-boggling terms for numbers like quattro, quinquag, introducentillion can be thrown around willy-nilly to make the point that given enough time, almost anything is, in theory, possible. But science has since discovered, and most scientists now agree, that the universe did indeed have a beginning. This is a big deal. It hasn't just always been there.
We were talking yesterday about competing worldviews and about the idea that you could provide, or I was going to make the case that you could provide reasons for faith. By faith, we meant a worldview or system of belief. And today we're going to begin to examine the case for theistic belief, the claim that the theistic worldview makes that the thing from which everything else comes, the prime reality, is a personal, intelligent God or creator. Now, you may know, if you've been paying attention to what's going on in the popular culture, that there's a new publishing phenomenon called the New Atheism. And you guys heard about these guys? Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. There's a group of these guys. They've made us no small fortune, each of them, by arguing that the evidence from science, from the natural world, points decisively against the existence of God. This is Dawkins at a debate that he was part of recently, and this is his closing statement.
When we go into a garden and we see how beautiful it is, and we see colored flowers, and we see the butterflies and the bees, of course it's natural to think there must be a gardener. Any fool is likely to think there must be a gardener. The huge achievement of Darwin was to show that that didn't have to be true. Of course it's difficult. Of course it had to wait until the mid-19th century before anybody thought of it. It seems so obvious that if you've got a garden, there must be a gardener who created it and all that goes with that. What Darwin did was to show the staggeringly counterintuitive fact that this not only can be explained by an undirected process. It's not chance, by the way. Entirely wrong to say it's chance. It's not chance. Natural selection is the very opposite of chance, and that's the essence of it. That was what Darwin discovered. He showed not only a garden, but everything in the living world, and in principle not just on this Earth, but on any other planet, wherever you see the organized complexity that we understand, that we call life, that it has an explanation which can derive it from simple beginnings by comprehensible, rational means. That is possibly the greatest achievement that any human mind has ever accomplished. Not only did he show that it could be done, I believe that we can argue that, that the alternative is so unparsimonious and so counter to the laws of common sense that, reluctant as we might be, because it might be unpleasant for us to admit it, although we can't disprove that there's a God, it is very, very unlikely indeed.
And so that's his opinion. That's his perspective. So what Dawkins and the New Atheists are saying is that science, properly understood, in particular in light of Darwin's theory of evolution, suggests that there's no positive evidence for God's existence, and moreover, that it's much more likely that there's no God at all. Now, have you guys encountered this perspective anywhere? You know, it's on the internet. You know, there's a whole website devoted to the advance of Richard Dawkins' perspective called the blasphemychallenge.com. It encourages students, young people, to say something blasphemous on camera and then upload their testimony onto the website. So this is not just a movement of scientists or writers, it's also becoming a movement in the popular culture. Now, obviously, this challenges some long-held beliefs. If you're a person of biblical faith, it challenges not only the belief that God exists, but also the belief that is affirmed in the Bible that there is something about nature that actually points to the existence of God, that testifies to the existence of God. You find this belief first stated perhaps in the Psalms, in the Old Testament, where David says that the heavens declare the glory of God. Notice the emphasis that he's laying there. It's the heavens, it's the things that are made. The next verse says, the skies proclaim the works of his hands. Now you get the same idea in the New Testament. St. Paul says, from what has been made, God's invisible qualities have been revealed. His eternal power and his divine nature are understood from what has been made. So again, the physical world, according to St. Paul, is directing us, pointing us, revealing something about the reality and attributes of the Creator, the God who made things. So this is Dawkins's perspective is obviously directly opposed to this ancient biblical tradition. But interestingly, it's also opposed to the mindset, the idea, the inspiration of modern science. The scientists who got science going in the first place, people like John Ray, who is the founder of modern biology, these scientists thought that they were discovering design in nature, and design that had come from the handiwork of God. Notice John Ray's title. It's The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. He's talking about the features of living systems that he thinks reveals the wisdom of the Creator, of his intelligence. Now, other scientists, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Boyle, they all had this same idea, that there was something about nature that was intelligible. That was a key word for them. It was intelligible. It could be understood because it was the product of a rational mind. And that rational mind they thought was God. They were mostly Christians, so they thought it was the God of the New and Old Testament. Their idea was that God had made the world to be orderly, to be designed, and because we were made, our minds were made in the image of the same rational God who had made the world, we could understand the world as well. Now, a couple years ago, I was testifying before something called the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The hearing was about whether or not there was viewpoint discrimination in public school science education. And when I heard that, I thought, well, duh. I wouldn't have thought you'd need a hearing to establish that, because if you know much about the way science is taught, particularly biology, this was about the Darwin controversy. The Darwin-only lobby is very strong, and most of the textbooks really only include a discussion of his theory and no evidence against it. I started to get interrogated by one of the commissioners in particular. He knew I was an advocate of the theory of intelligent design, and he started to quiz me about that. He wanted to know where I'd gone to school, and what did my Cambridge supervisors know that I had advocated the theory of intelligent design. But then suddenly, he turned kind of nice. He asked me a different question. He says, now this idea of intelligent design, he said, isn't that basically the same idea that Newton and Kepler and Robert Boyle all believed? And when he said Robert Boyle, one of my heroes, I kind of brightened and realized, hey, maybe this guy's on my side. And so I said, you know, you're absolutely right. In fact, Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, these guys, early founders of science, they not only made advances in their scientific disciplines, physics, chemistry, etc., but they also made design arguments. They were advocates of this theory. And then right as I said this, my opposite number jumped in and said, well, no, but it's true that Newton was very religious. And he believed in intelligent design, but he took great pains to keep his ideas about intelligent design out of his science. And I had, as it happened, just written an essay that had this quotation on the second page, and it was in my briefcase. Newton's talking about the fine-tuning, the arrangement of the planets and the comets. And he says, this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, capital B. He's actually making a design argument about the precise configuration of the planets. He says, my law of gravity describes why things hold together, but it doesn't explain how they got configured just right to maintain this stable balance of forces. It's a very complex physics problem to see how all those planets exerting gravitational force on each other could maintain that stability. And he said the best explanation, he thought, was that there must have been an intelligent and powerful being, capital B. So here's the question. How did we get from Newton to Dawkins? How do we get from Newton saying that the evidence of the physical world reveals the handiwork of the Creator to Dawkins, who says just the opposite? Well, there's a story. There's often a story. It's an historical story, but it started really about the beginning of the 19th century, about the year 1800. There was a physicist named Laplace, Pierre Laplace, and he wrote a book that purported to do exactly what Sir Isaac Newton said you couldn't do, which was explain the origin of the solar system by reference to the law of gravity alone, with no design, And there's a story, it may or may not be true, historians aren't sure, but apparently Laplace was sent a copy of his book to the French Emperor Napoleon. And Napoleon called him in and wanted to give him a commendation for having written such an important book. But he asked him a question. He said, when I've read the works of Sir Isaac Newton, he mentions God quite frequently in his scientific texts, but I didn't hear any mention of God at all in your book. And according to the, at least apocryphal story, Laplace is said to have puffed himself up and said, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." That was my French accent. You were supposed to appreciate that. Okay. I have no need of what hypothesis? The God hypothesis, the hypothesis of design. And that was 1802. Roll the clock forward. During the rest of the century, you have scientists in geology who are beginning to explain the mountains, the canyons, all the dramatic geological features by reference to slow, gradual, and purely undirected processes. Many of them great explanations. You have in biology Darwin coming along, and he explains the origin of completely new forms of life. And you saw from Richard Dawkins' testimony how important he thinks that is in getting rid of the need to invoke design, or still further, the idea of God as the intelligent designer. And here's a quote from a biology textbook. Maybe some of you have encountered this already. This is Douglas Fatuma, prominent evolutionary biologist. He says that by coupling the undirected purposeless variations to blind, uncaring processes of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life process superfluous. No need of that hypothesis. Superfluous, unnecessary. Okay? So you have it first in astronomy, then geology, then in biology. Beyond that, other scientists start to extend this way of thinking, and they propose evolutionary explanations for the origin of the very first life and for the origin of human life. Now you've got a picture of the origin of all the important features of the physical world that is purely explained by undirected natural processes with no guidance and no design. Is there one thing that they haven't explained?
How it all began.
How did it all begin? Yeah, well, where'd the matter come from in the first place, maybe? Guess what? They had an explanation for that as well. Or at least they had a way of looking at the universe that implied there was no need for an explanation. Because at the time, the physicists believed that the universe was infinite in time and space. There's a story that Stephen Hawking used to tell about a graduate student that would go off to a fancy Ivy League college. And he's learning about astronomy, and he learns that the planets are going around and around the sun, and that they're suspended in free space by the force of gravitational attraction. And he's fascinated by this, and he's back home at Christmas time. He's at a church picnic, and he starts to talk about this wonderful thing he's learned. And a little old lady comes up to him and says, "Well, that's pretty interesting," she says, "but it's not right about the planets being suspended in free space." And he says, "Well," he says, "what do you mean?" And she says, "The Earth sits on the back of a turtle." And the young guy says, "Yeah, but what's underneath the turtle?" And the little old lady says, "Well, I can see you're real smart, but it's going to do you no good. It's turtles all the way down." Okay, obviously, vicious stereotyping of people from the South, but you get the idea that, well, you don't, because I haven't applied it yet. The idea in cosmology is that you've got not turtles all the way down, it's material causes all the way back, okay, to no beginning point. If you say, what caused human life to arise? Well, we evolved by undirected processes from lower animals. Where did they come from? Still lower animals. Where did they come from? Well, that amoeba, or that first cell arising from the primordial soup. Where did that come from? Simpler chemicals. Where did they come from? Elementary particles. Where did they come from? They were there all the time. All the way back, all the way back. By the end of the 19th century, there is a worldview that arises. We call it materialism, is the worldview, or scientific materialism, because it derives from scientific theories. Simplistically, here's how it goes. From eternity past were the particles. and the particles became complex stuff, and the complex stuff evolved and became alive, and that living stuff evolved and got more complex, and eventually one of those complex living things conceived of the idea of God. Now in the theistic worldview, it's just the opposite. What comes first?
God.
God, okay? So in the theistic worldview, it's God first, matter second. God speaks the universe into existence in the book of Genesis, right? But in the materialistic worldview, it's matter first. And matter's been there from eternity past. There is no beginning. So the picture of the universe that you get as the result of this rising tide of materialistic theories of origins is a picture of the universe which is eternal, self-existent, self-creating, self-organizing, and autonomous from any outside forces, okay? Or more particularly, from any idea in the mind of God. There is no design, no purpose, no God, okay? And that was the picture I showed yesterday of the materialistic worldview looking kind of like this, with nothing beyond the physical world. Now notice how this plays into Dawkins's ideas as he's developing this for popular consumption in his book, The God Delusion. He says, creative intelligences being evolved necessarily arrive late in the universe, and therefore cannot be responsible for designing it. In other words, he's saying the only place where there's mind, where there's consciousness, is in us, and we're the product of an undirected, mindless process. So there can't be any design, and therefore there's no evidence of God's existence. Yeah, go ahead.
What did Richard Dawkins mean then by saying that it wasn't by chance?
The brief answer is just that according to Darwinian understanding, the mechanism that produces the change, all the new forms of life, is not just chance, it's random variations being acted on by natural selection. So it's undirected, but it's not chance alone, okay? So it's a nuance that needs to be included. Now, what I want to talk about today is the new evidence that I think actually completely undercuts these new atheists. Actually, the new atheism is the old atheism repackaged to make bestsellers. But I think it's completely out of touch with the most current developments in science, which I think support the very opposite worldview conclusion. The story really begins in the 1920s, and it begins with a guy named Edwin Hubble. And Hubble is an astronomer who was a lawyer, and he went to astronomy because he got really interested in the subject, and it was at just the right time because there were these great big, huge dome telescopes that were first beginning to be built. Here's the picture of one, the Palomar Observatory at Mount Wilson. It's a great 200-inch dome telescope. And the great thing about these telescopes is that they could, for the first time, resolve little tiny points of light that were in the distant night sky. And people for a long time, scientists, astronomers, didn't know whether there were any galaxies beyond our own. And when Hubble began to bring those points of light into focus, he made an amazing discovery. These little tiny points of light, they had structure. They had shape. Some of them were in the shape of spirals. This was an incredible discovery because as he searched the night sky more, one of the things he discovered was that in every quadrant of the sky, as far back or deep as you looked into the field of the stars, there were galaxies and galaxies and galaxies in every direction. Now, this was a stunning discovery because, for one thing, it makes you aware of how vast the universe is. And this is a picture of what's called the Hubble Deep Field. And you see that there's galaxies everywhere. Now, see where the arrow is pointing. On the next slide, we're going to expand in just that quadrant and see that that little tiny piece is also full of galaxies. Are you starting to get a feeling of being very small? Okay, this is an enormous universe. So Hubble made this incredible discovery, and he discovered something else. And this is where it really gets interesting. He discovered that as they began to examine the light coming from the galaxies, that the further the galaxy was away, the faster it was receding. This is a little picture of the evidence that helped establish that. Okay, do you guys know what the Doppler effect is, or Doppler shift? Okay, if you're talking about, for example, sound, if you've got a train that's receding away from you, what happens to the pitch of the sound? Goes down. Okay, it goes down. Okay, that's the Doppler shift, all right? Well, it turns out the same thing happens with light. If you're looking at a distant object and that object is moving away from you, the wavelength of the light stretches out. And that means you're looking at it from the standpoint of the ultraviolet spectrum. It goes to the red end of the spectrum. It looks redder in color than it would otherwise look. You know, if you shine light through a prism, you get a spectrum of light from red to violet. Well, that's what Hubble discovered about the galaxies. The further away they were, the more the light was shifted into the red direction of the spectrum. Think about what that means as you go forward in time. What's happening? If every direction in space, you've got galaxies moving outward, 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 what's happening to the universe as a whole? It's expanding. It's getting bigger, right? So as you go forward in time, something like this is what's going on. This is my high-tech illustration, a balloon here. Okay, got red galaxies drawn on there, red for the red shift. It's redder than it would otherwise be. Each puff represents going forward in time. Some backwash there, okay? All right, there we got a universe expanding outward, right? So the discovery of the red shift in the light ends up supporting this new concept of the universe called the expanding universe. It's going outward in time in all directions. But now what happens if you go back in time? Imagine that you're winding the cosmic time scale back. What happens to the universe as you're going backwards? It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Can you see that eventually all the matter in the universe, all the stuff out of which those galaxies are made, is going to compress into a single point? And you get to what is in essence a beginning to the expansion. Now, just as Hubble was coming to this, actually a few years before, there was a guy who'd come to the very same conclusion in Princeton. He's kind of famous. He's got really bad hair. Albert Einstein, okay? Remember about Einstein? He had this famous theory called, not Big Bang. Relativity. Relativity, okay? You're pretty good, though, because Hubble's thing became the Big Bang, all right? And Einstein, his basically was a theory of gravity. And his idea was a little different than Newton's. He thought that if you had a massive body, it would actually curve space. So think of like a bowling ball on a trampoline. If you put the bowling ball on the trampoline, what's it going to do to space? Or the surface? It's going to curve it. And that's what he thought. If there's a massive body, it would cause space around the body to be curved. And he had a lot of reasons for thinking that, and it turned out to be a pretty good idea. But here's the thing. If there's mass in the universe, then what's happening to the space all around the mass? It's being curved, and it would have to contract. So if his force of gravity was the only thing at work, then he realized that we'd be in a universe that had no spatial volume. Everything would be compressed on itself. So then he thought there must be some force that is countering that, that's expanding. And he had some equations that described essentially the physics, and the equations implied that the force of expansion was a little stronger than the force of gravity, so that the universe was expanding outward. And that's what his theory of relativity implied. That's what the math implied. But Einstein didn't like that idea very much. Because if you have an expanding universe, what happens if you go back in time? You got a single point. In fact, in his thinking, since space is connected to matter, if you go back far enough, you get to a point where there's going to be, where space is going to contract, okay, maybe even to a 0 point. All right? So he thought, man, this is a profound conclusion, but I don't like it, because it implies the need for a cause beyond the universe. If there's a beginning, there must be something to cause the beginning, something that isn't the universe itself. So he was very troubled by this, and what he did was he introduced into his equations an arbitrary factor. It's called his cosmological constant. It was essentially a numeric value that described not a force of expansion, but a contrary force of contraction that was calibrated just right so that the expanding force and the contracting force were in perfect balance so that we had a static universe again. So it was just sitting here like from eternity past doing nothing. Not expanding, not contracting, just sitting there. And he felt a lot better about that. The problem was the heavens talked back. And he began to get information from Edwin Hubble about what he was discovering about the fact that the universe really is expanding, just like Einstein's own theory indicated. So there's some famous newsreel footage where Einstein, having gotten an invitation from Hubble, comes out to the Palomar Observatory, and he gets to see the evidence of the expanding universe. He goes into one of these big telescopes, and he comes out, and you already see the punchline. He comes out and he says to the media, "I now see the necessity of a beginning." the German accent. Okay, pretty good, huh? Don't you think? Auf a beginning. Einstein was great. Okay, so so he later says this cosmological constant that he kind of made up. He later said that was the biggest mistake of his scientific career. He should have just let the physics tell him what reality was about, and not. See, what was the problem? He had a preconceived philosophical notion, didn't he? He thought the universe must be eternal. He did not like the idea of a universe that had a finite beginning point. Now, he wasn't the only one. Some of the other physicists at the time, this astrophysicist from Britain, Sir Arthur Eddington, he did not like the idea at all, so he came up with a different theory. Here was his idea. He says, philosophically, the notion of a beginning to the present order is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole. I simply do not believe the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe, he says, is preposterous. It leaves me cold. Okay. When I did this talk at my kids' school one time, and they said, Dad, everybody likes your talk, but could you lose those accents? You know? Okay. All right. What's this theory? Eddington's got a theory, doesn't he? It's got a name. Okay. In psychology, they call it denial. Did he give you any evidence?
No.
No. Why doesn't he like the expanding universe?
Personal feeling.
What's the first word? Philosophically, I don't like it. Okay. He's got a personal philosophy that says you can't have a finite universe. Now, what's the problem here? What's bugging people? Well, one physicist from Princeton a number of years later explained it. He says that an infinitely old universe relieves us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. If it's infinite in time, then matter can be the thing from which everything else comes. We don't need to think about a creator beyond the universe. See, there was this ancient argument the medieval theologians and philosophers made. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause that transcends itself, that comes from outside itself. And then they'd say, we call that cause God. Well, if the universe didn't begin to exist, that argument has no force. The problem is, the evidence now points in the other direction. Now, I had the opportunity in 1985 to attend a conference, which I'll probably tell you a little bit more about later, because it really changed my life. And I went in, it was a conference on the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and this big question of consciousness. And one of the astronomers that spoke there was then in his 60s. He had been Edwin Hubble's student, and he had verified the linear expansion of the universe in all the directions of space. He was one of the guys who did the experimental work on the red shift. And his impression of that, of what that implied is stated right here. He said at this conference, here is evidence, talking about the evidence of the finite universe, for what can only be described as a supernatural event. There is no way, he said, this could have been predicted from within the realm of physics as we know it. At this conference, Dr. Sandage, who'd been a long-time agnostic, surprised everyone. Everyone thought Sandage was going to give his testimony on the side of the materialist. He announced at this conference that he'd come to a belief in God, in part because of the discoveries of modern science. So something really exciting is happening in cosmology with respect to the God question. And another astronomer puts it this way. Robert Jastrow, he's written a book called God and the Astronomers. And he says, this is an exceedingly strange development. He's talking about what is now called the Big Bang Theory and the evidence for a finite universe. He says, unexpected by all but the theologians. They have always accepted the word of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's unexpected, he says, because science has had such extraordinary success in tracing the chain of cause and effect backward in time. Turtles all the way back, right? For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Okay, so obviously there's something about the discovery of the finite universe that's upsetting to a lot of physicists and astronomers. In particular, it seems to many of them to point to the possibility of a transcendent cause or creator of the universe as a whole. And that's very upsetting to those, especially those who hold a materialistic or naturalistic worldview that think that it's turtles all the way back. In our next session, we're going to talk a bit more about why the discovery of a finite universe has positive implications for theistic belief. In other words, why it provides a reason to believe that God might exist.
Theories about undirected natural processes claim to account for the origin of the complexity of life that we see. But these laws of nature merely describe the interactions of material parts within the universe. So if the universe had a beginning, then what was the cause of that beginning? Is there a worldview grand enough to give an account, a logical explanation to that big question of how did all of this begin?